welcome. You're watching Money Control. I'm Sakshi Batra, and with me is Gaurav Chaudhary, is the Deputy Executive Editor of Money Control. And the report card on India's financial health is out. Chief Economic Advisor Dr. K.V. Subramanian's maiden economic survey has been tabled in the Parliament, and we are here to discuss the key highlights that have been pointed out in the survey. Thanks a lot, Gaurav, for joining in. A while back, we were discussing all the expectations on various sectors of the economy. The big highlight that has first come about is the projection, the economic growth projection for FY20 at 7% GDP. What are your thoughts?
7% is quite optimistic, I should say. And that note of optimism is also driven by the fact that the survey and obviously the authors of the survey, including the Chief Economic Advisor and his team, think that investment is bottom out. The survey goes on to say that in Jan-March quarter, the investment was sluggish. Yes. Investment levels were sluggish primarily because of uncertainties regarding the electoral cycle, and that clearly will gather pace. At least that's what the key think tank within the finance ministry seems to think. Yeah. Also, it has, however, warned, and there are a few warning signs there in the survey itself. One, that fiscal gap, the government has very little fiscal elbow room. Yeah. To push public investment, and at times of sluggish private investment, generally policymakers resort to the instrument of raising public investment. But public investment here, or if driving welfare schemes by borrowing more, is something that the survey is warned against, in the sense that it is very little fiscal. It should not try to widen the fiscal gap. The government, that is something that the government probably will be very alive to, that recommendation, that observation. It has also talked about policy consistency, and that is a very important point. The policy investors, especially of the transnational kind, are one of the proximate reasons for roiling investor sentiment is policy inconsistency. Sure. And that is why policy consistency is absolutely important, because your investors are investing money over a long period of time, and if there are flip-flops in policy statements or policy legislations or regulations, that is something that can chase investors away. That's absolutely critical. It also talks about a few things about what's wrong with Indian agriculture and what needs to do about it. It has placed particular emphasis on using, trying to push dairy sector, which is a non-farm activity within the rural economy, and giving a big boost to it. Clearly, that's something that we can expect something to come about in the budget as well. Likewise, on the fisheries sector as well. Importantly, it seems very bullish about investment rate bottoming out. It also goes on to say that the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, that advises the RBI on interest rate decisions, will probably likely continue an accommodative stance. So probably the survey believes, and within the finance ministry, the core think tank believes that interest rates will remain benign for some time to come.
Absolutely. So lots of important points in your first answer, and I will pick one by one each of them to understand them in more detail. First of all, about the investment front. Now, the survey does point out that the investment rate has bottomed out. It also says that the decline in NPAs should also push for more capex going ahead. Yeah. So do you think from now onwards the capex cycle will revive?
Yeah, it will, but that we should always remember that companies will start investing only when consumption picks up. Yes. Because there is still a lot of unused capacity within the system among companies. Yes. And once that unused capacity is not completely used up, companies may not feel confident to add more capacity lines. So additional investment is clearly going to be a function of how consumption spending picks up. Yes. And the big trigger for consumption spending is going to come from what the government does in the budget on July 5. Yes. If there is more money given in the hands of people to spend, then clearly that has the potential to trigger a cycle of spending and investment. But as going by what the survey has said, clearly Subramanian and his team thinks that capex cycle is going to pick up. It may come with a time lag, but as I said, a lot will depend on how consumption spending picks up, because consumption spending is also a matter of consumer confidence. Yes. We go and buy a car not because we think that based on our current income, but we also buy a car because what we believe our future income is going to be, because a car is financed. Sure. So we should have the confidence of our ability to repay a
Yes.
car loan over a period of time. Likewise for houses, and that depends on consumer confidence.
Yes.
That is where the whole issue of sentiment comes in. So I think a lot will depend on how the budget, the measures that are announced in the budget tomorrow,
Yes.
to the extent that it drives consumer sentiment and
Sure,
confidence,
sure.
and that could clearly trigger some kind of investment activity.
Absolutely. And you did say that, consumption is an important point and where we all need to revive consumption. And one part is the MPC and the rate cuts, which could actually boost the investments. Survey points out that any accommodative monetary policy committee or the lowering of interest rates will definitely boost consumption from here on as well. Yeah. So do you expect more rate cuts? We've already seen 3.
Clearly. So there is always a possibility of more rate cut. The room is there.
Yeah.
Given the fact that inflation remains very benign.
Yes.
And also a lot will depend on how monsoon behaves.
Sure.
But according to what the Met Department has been forecasting, monsoon will gather pace in the coming days.
Yes.
It should cover the entire country. And I think in the weakening that we saw in the month of June should not persist in the month of July.
Yeah.
If that happens, then food inflation clearly will remain bottled up. If food inflation remains bottled up, and consumer spending picks up, food inflation remaining bottled up and plentiful harvest is a good sign for the industrial sector also, because a large number of spending on industrial products, say, or consumer products like say, televisions or cars or tractors, also depends on how farmers earn their income in the Kharif crop.
Sure.
If the Kharif crop holds its line and the harvest is quite plentiful, the summer harvest, then I think consumption spending should pick up, and then if food inflation remains firmly under control, inflation clearly is going to interest rates clear. The MPC will have more confidence in suggesting more interest rate cuts. That is going to be a win-win so far as consumption spending is concerned, because the second round of cuts or the next round of cuts in interest rates probably will come closer to the festival season buying, and that could bring in more cheer. So that is critical. And so, as I said, monsoon rains and the way food inflation behaves in the coming 2 months is going to determine which interests are going to move.
Absolutely. But, a broad look at the survey actually seems that, investments is written all over it. And what is needed really now for the government? Will it really pick it up from this point in time, from the survey itself? And what will it take to push the animal spirits in the economy? Really?
Yeah, so it has said that, in one of the very first chapters in second volume, which is the operative volume, it does, in the outlook part of that chapter, when it gives an overview of the state of the economy, it does say that it starts that subsection by saying that this government, there has been a huge political backing or a landslide victory. And this government has come in on the back of a landslide victory.
Yes.
And the same rate, it also goes on to show that, it goes on to say that political stability should drive animal spirits.
Yes.
And that is critical, because it's hinting, or it is rather suggesting the government in a very oblique manner that they should go for a jugular. So probably the survey is trying to convey a message to the government that don't adopt, you should probably abandon the previous approach of gradualism and go for a big bang approach.
Right.
Maybe the time to go for broke on policy making, on legislative changes, on regulatory changes has come.
Absolutely. And you did say that 7% GDP growth rate is definitely very, very positive. And what is really needed, the slowdown, the reasons for the slowdown actually pointed out in the survey also include NBFC stress for FY19. Now, going forward in the budget and otherwise as well, can we expect, the government to take more steps to at least push this sector forward and to help this sector?
Yeah, so there are two ways that the government and RBI is probably looking at to deal with NBFC stress. One is the regulatory change. Now, this is the peculiarity in the Indian financial sector regulatory architecture, that the RBI doesn't have full control over NBFCs, and that will require a legislative change. So the government probably is very open to the idea of giving more power to the RBI to regulate NBFCs, and that is going to help the NBFC sector. But we cannot think of a situation where the shadow banks, which is the NBFC sector, remains in stress for too long a time, because they perform a very vital role in keeping the economy oiling, because it's not just the banks who are lending. NBFCs do a large part of lending in the consumer lending space, as well as also in asset buying like houses, etc.
Sure.
So that you cannot have a situation where that tap continues to remain dry for a very long time, because then, while for NBFCs it's a liquidity problem, For consumers, it's a credit problem. So the pool of lendable resources shrinks considerably. And that is why I expect some kind of at least noise or some kind of, the phraseology that the finance minister tomorrow uses when she eventually, if she talks about NBFCs, is going to be very interesting to see, because it's going to tell us which way the government is thinking to solve the NBFC crisis.
Right. I also have to ask you about the fiscal situation. Now, that is very important. What does the survey really talk about the fiscal situation in the economy, and also what do you make of the general fiscal deficit target that has been given at 5.8%?
So they have said that the general fiscal deficit is the combined fiscal deficit of the center and the states, and that's about 5.8%. So it's come down. It's going to, according to the survey, it's going to come down from about 6.4%. But important to note here is what is the kind of fiscal deficit that the government is going to project tomorrow?
Yes.
Is it going to revise it from what it had projected in the interim budget at 3.4% for 1920 and bring it down to eventually 3%? I don't think the government will be able to stick to that, because the estimates made in the interim budgets have changed considerably, given on the actual tax revenue earnings. That is one point. But we need to keep in mind that combined fiscal deficit is also a function to the extent which states are borrowing. And clearly the survey is saying it's not just the center that is at fault here. State borrowing will also have to come down. And there are also other things, components like what is often referred to as off-balance sheet items, like FCI borrowing, Food Corporation of India borrowing to procure food grains. That is also very high. So the total consolidated fiscal deficit of public sector borrowing, of Food Corporation of India borrowing, states and center, is still very close to 10%, and that's very, very high.
Absolutely. Now I have to ask you about what do you make of the difference? Do you see any clear difference between Chief Economic Advisor Dr. K.V. Subramanian's survey and his predecessors as well? You had certain expectations from his as well,
so,
his maiden survey as well.
Clearly, he seems to be a big fan of Arthashastra. He has quoted him very, very liberally. But there are a few commonalities and there are a few distinct differences. First, the commonalities. He also seems to be very, very interested, and he seems to have an enduring interest in literature, which he has, and you can make that from the liberal, the very liberal sprinkling of quotes across various chapters. Unlike Arvind Subramanian, he hasn't quoted. He hasn't used literary quotes in every chapter, but in many chapters he has used. He goes on to quote very liberally from the Arthashastra. So that is a commonality, but the difference is in the presentation. So he has a more professorial approach, if I may use that word. Every chapter there is a summary which says that the chapter at a glance at the end of the chapter, which it is as if trying to teach a chapter or a subject to a student. And that probably comes from his background before this job as a professor of Indian School of Business. And that is something that really is going to help for, it's going to be great help for researchers who are looking for very focused information and insight. They exactly would know where to go to look for that particular piece of information. This is one big change that, as somebody who loves to deal with macroeconomic data, I think this is a very, very welcome change that has been brought about in the economic survey.
Right. Thanks a lot, then, Gaurav, for sharing all those insights on the economic survey. Well, the health card report is out of the financial health of the Indian economy of the year gone by. There are several, important points that have been brought about in the economic survey for various sectors of the economy, be it agriculture, environment, also investments, GST. There's a whole lot of talk on how the government really needs to take policy, measures to at least spur growth as well going forward from here. Political stability is definitely important for pushing the animal spirits in the economy as well, and investments is the key driver for the economy going forward as well. All those things have been packed in this power-packed economic survey of 2019. Well, all eyes are now on tomorrow when the budget document will be presented. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will rise to present the union budget tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the Parliament, and we'll just have to wait and watch out for as to what has the budget really picked up from the economic survey of 2019. Thanks a lot for joining us in this edition of Editor's Take, and do stay logged on to moneycontrol.com for more news and updates. Thanks for watching.